Hello. Today we have the privilege of hearing from Dr. Susan Waltz, professor in the Department of Cancer Biology. She is our basic researcher, or one of our basic researchers in breast cancer here at the University of Cincinnati. And I feel so honored to have her to tell you a little bit about breast cancer research at UC Health in 2020, and certainly in the midst of this pandemic. Susan.
Hi, Dr. Lauer. Thank you for being here and thank you for inviting me to do this. And what I'd like to do today is tell you about some of the research efforts that are going on at the University of Cincinnati and UC Health. And you might want to ask, well, what are the research efforts and who's involved in those? Well, we have a collaborative team composed of clinical doctors and basic scientists, as well as educators and caregivers, and a lot of students and trainees who are involved in our breast cancer team. And these researchers and clinicians come from a variety of different departments throughout the university, like basic science departments, including cancer biology, which I'm part of, and medical oncology, in which Dr. Lauer is part of. And we all work together on breast cancer research efforts. And there's about 20 dedicated laboratories at the University of Cincinnati that are solely focused on breast cancer research. You may ask, what are some of the accomplishments of our breast cancer research team in 2020? And just in this year to date, we've published over 30 research publications. And a lot of these publications have been published in top-notch journals and are co-authored by a lot of our basic scientists and clinical investigators as part of our breast cancer team. In addition, our breast cancer researchers have garnered a lot of significant funding from a number of different agencies to support breast cancer research efforts at the University of Cincinnati. And these include agencies like the National Cancer Institute, the Susan Komen Foundation, and the American Cancer Society. We also have a significant commitment from the community and the institution that provides research funding to support brand new ideas in breast cancer research. And we also have nationally funded programs that help train the next generation of breast cancer researchers at the University of Cincinnati. And you might ask, well, what are some of the scientific breakthroughs that have been discovered at the University of Cincinnati? And I can tell you about two in particular that have occurred in 2020. And one is a study that was published by a group including my laboratory in collaboration with Dr. Lauer and a radiation oncologist, Dr. Vanita Takiar, where we've identified a novel prognostic marker that might predict the ability of breast cancer patients to survive and or have metastatic disease. And there's another paper that was recently published looking at the ability to enhance immunotherapy in breast cancer patients by inhibiting a unique protein called FIP200, which was sponsored or published by Dr. Junlin Guan and his associates earlier this year. And just to tell you a little bit about some of these very exciting novel studies that were published, as I mentioned, one of the published studies identified a novel prognostic marker of breast cancer survival and metastatic progression. And the advantage of this study, or what was unique about this study, is we used a lot of samples that were obtained from UC Health and the University of Cincinnati in collaboration with other big breast cancer groups throughout the nation. And we were able to take all of these tumor samples that we had, and one of the big advantages of the samples that we collected is that they had long-term survival of patients associated with them. So we were able to take these tumor samples and actually show and look for different markers that may be predictive of overall survival, recurrent disease, and metastatic progression. And we were able to identify a particular marker called MST1R, or the RON receptor, that's highly expressed in a large number of breast cancers. And we were able to show that high levels of expression of this receptor can really predict survival in different patients, meaning high levels of this receptor in tumor samples might be associated with a decreased survival in breast cancer patients compared to patient samples that might have lower levels. And this was also indicative of metastases in these patients. Patients with high levels of this marker had higher levels of metastasis later on compared to patients that might have had low levels of this receptor. And we also found that this was an independent prognostic marker in that it's independent of, for instance, other markers, for instance, markers of the estrogen receptor or the HER2 receptor, in that it can be an independent predictor of breast cancer survival and or recurrence. So again, this study was published in June of this year, and it identified a potential marker that might be able to be used sometime clinically to look at breast cancer survival and or progression. In another study, published in September of this year, looking at enhancing immunotherapy in breast cancer patients. And this was done by Dr. Guan and colleagues, and he was able to show in animal models that animal models of breast cancer, when you inhibit a protein or block a protein called FIP200, it actually decreased the ability of animals to get breast cancer. And one of the novel findings from this study is his group was able to show when you inhibited FIP200 in breast cancers, you were able to bring more immune cells into these tumors than tumors that had FIP200. And knowing that immunotherapy can work in a lot of cancers, however, it's not very effective in breast cancers, they decided then to treat animals with and without FIP200 in their breast cancers and look to see how they respond to immunotherapy. And they were able to show in breast cancers that had FIP200, regardless of the immunotherapy that was performed, these tumors were unresponsive to immunotherapy. However, when you lose FIP200 in these breast cancers, they were able to show that different immunotherapies and combination immunotherapies were able to actually increase survival of these animals. So they were able to show that you can take non-responsive breast cancers that are non-responsive to immunotherapy and actually make them responsive to immunotherapy by targeting FIP200. And then finally, you might ask, so what's going on at the University of Cincinnati in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic? And there have been 11 studies that have been funded by the University of Cincinnati itself to actually look at COVID-19. And many of these studies look at COVID-19 in cancer and in cancer patients. And there's one study in particular that was spearheaded by Tricia Wise Draper to really understand the effects of COVID-19 in cancer patients. And some of the studies that they're really looking at right now, and they're ongoing, are studies to examine the timing of anti-cancer treatments in cancer patients and COVID-19 complications. And they've been able to find that mortality is higher in patients that are undergoing active cancer treatment. And this occurred in most patients except for patients that were undergoing endocrine therapy. And it also suggests that cancer patients with recent therapies, anywhere from about 1 to 3 months prior to having a COVID-19 positive diagnosis, could experience higher mortality rates than people who had been treated much earlier. So more research is going on, and we're trying to understand how the pandemic is going to have consequences on patient care. So just to summarize, I hope I've been able to tell you a little bit about some of the breast cancer research that's going on at the University of Cincinnati and UC Health, and really with the ultimate goal of trying to improve patient outcomes. We're trying to understand the basic biology of breast cancer, and by understanding the basic biology of breast cancer, we're trying to find new ways to treat unresponsive cancers, for instance, by targeting FIP200 and using immunotherapy. We're finding new markers that might be important for diagnosis and treatment, and this is, again, understanding the expression of MST1R and whether or not you could use that as a diagnostic factor in patients that may recur earlier or have metastases. And we're trying to understand what the effect of the pandemic is on cancer care.
So, Dr. Waltz, clearly research is the key to the future. And there's not a day that goes by that my patients don't ask me about what's new, what's happening. And it's so gratifying to know that you and your colleagues have been able to keep up the research fight despite that total shutdown. Can you tell us a little bit about how things worked the first 2 or 3 months? Were you in the lab? What happened? Did it affect you as a researcher like it affected some of the doctors and clinical people?
Yeah, so during the pandemic, it was quite a challenge because we had the shutdown and stay-at-home orders imposed by the state of Ohio. And basically, much of the research that was going on in the laboratory outside of really critical research that couldn't be recovered was stopped. So as a researcher and as part of a big research group, we were able to at least focus initially on writing papers and grant applications, as well as used a lot of online methods to stay in touch and decide what we wanted to start up with when we were allowed to get back into the laboratories. So fortunately, we've been able to persevere through this time and stay at home, and we're still at the point where we're ramping up research efforts as a result of the shutdown that we had.
Yeah. You had to be very creative, no
Absolutely.
2 ways about that. But sometimes it's good to have a little pause button that gives you the chance to think rather than just keep doing. So we're so grateful that you're able to keep pushing ahead. One thing you mentioned, which I think is so important, is grassroots efforts to support our research activities, particularly things like Ride Cincinnati. As many of you may know, that's become a virtual ride because of the pandemic. But certainly we are looking for sponsorship, so I'll put my little plug in here. Google and get in touch with the Ride Cincinnati group, because any contribution you can make is going to be used all for research purposes here at UC Health. And I cannot stress that enough. It helps us to fund some of our junior researchers, as well as people trying to get into the new field and just need some pilot information. I want to thank you and your colleagues so much for everything that you do. I have 2 burning questions. The first is, was there a silver lining that you personally or professionally experienced because of the pandemic?
Yeah, as part of the pandemic, since everyone had to stay at home and socially separate, what we did is generate a lot of ideas, mostly virtually, to stay in touch. And I was able to stay in touch with many of my family who I wouldn't necessarily stay in touch with as much, as well as friends and colleagues throughout the country to talk about ideas, because we had a little bit more time. And personally, that was very beneficial for me.
Yeah, it's very gratifying, absolutely. Yeah. And then finally, do you have a crystal ball that helps us to estimate when you think this pandemic will end? As a scientist, do you have an inside track here?
Well, I'm hoping with the advent of some vaccines and therapies that within the next year we can at least get back to a new normal during the pandemic, and I'm hopeful that the scientists will be making breakthroughs as we go.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to extend my congratulations to you, because you got that big R01 from the National Cancer Institute in the midst of the pandemic. That's like the jewel in the crown. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah. And thanks again for everything you do for our patients and research and UC Health and the University of Cincinnati.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed today's discussion with Dr. Waltz, who updated us on the importance of breast cancer research during the pandemic. If you enjoyed this, please make sure that you pass the information on to others by posting to your social media. Next week, we have the privilege of hearing from Diana Sutherland, one of our nurse practitioners at UC Health. She helps to co-direct our RAMP program, which is our Risk Assessment and Management program. She will be talking about preventing breast diseases amidst the pandemic. Thank you, and we look forward to hearing from you next week.